right there. So you can see, even by Darwin's own admission, what was going on there, okay? So one thing I want you to hear today, a lot of, is assumption and deception, because you see a lot of that in evolution. All right, before we really get started, some of you probably are new to apologetics. So a quick question for you, especially for those of you who have been here before. Why do we do these classes? Say it again. To defend your faith. That's exactly right. Any other answers besides that? Any others? Okay, so Lee's right. So it's to understand facts. Okay, we study the facts. We look at the science. We look at these things, and to determine what's right and wrong, and compare that to what we're taught in schools, which is a lot of assumptions and deceptions, especially when it comes to evolution. All right. So it's what we learn how to say for our faith, okay, to be able to defend our faith. So apologetics is our defense, whereas the gospel is the offense, okay? The gospel is the offense, and apologetics is kind of your defense, all right? So last week we looked at several incredible statistics that showed macroevolution is impossible, and as you see from the video, why some of these statistics were so incredible. And we asked a trick question. What was the trick question? Anybody? Do you believe in evolution? Is evolution true or false? That's a trick question. Why was that? Huh? Okay, what's the differences? What's the two? Micro and macro, right. And so we gave some examples. Let me get one. So we gave several examples of micro and macro evolution, and we do see some changes in microevolution, like the Galapagos finches, and changes you see, and then they roll in macroevolution teaching, okay? Then we also talked about the Bible and said like kinds, and then along comes Darwin, and he reclassifies it and says species, but there's a big, big difference in the two, and Joel passed the test really well. Good job, Joel. I said that even a 5-year-old could pass, remember the 10? All right, so he at least qualifies for a 5-year-old. Right. Just kidding, just kidding. All right, so that was a test right there we talked about, okay? Let me go back there. 1 second. Give me 1 second. All right, so there's the test. And he passed. So minus the banana, the rest are like kinds, and variations do happen within limits. But what some will say is these are different species, okay? But they are a like kind. So keep that in mind, because it's very important, because they'll be sneaky, and this is kind of where the sneakiness comes into play, a lot of it. So keep that in mind. So be aware. A side note, just always good to give credit where credit's due. A lot of the commentary that I use for this particular lesson is from Tim Aubrey, who is a very good apologist and friend, so it's good to give credit and acknowledge sources used. So for evolution, the argument generally begins with a word known as abiogenesis, okay? Anybody know what this word means?
The study of living things derived from
Very good, very good. If you don't want to make one, I know you'll get a bunch more. There you go. All right, so it's the study on how living things could arise from non-living matter on their own, okay? Very good. There's a fatal flaw in this belief, very fatal. Fatal flaw, okay? It lacks no scientific or philosophical evidence. That's pretty major. Hopefully you would see that. Okay. Anybody know what else this is known as?
Spontaneous generation.
Finally spoke up. Spontaneous generation is also known as that. Okay? So has everybody heard of this term, spontaneous generation? Yeah. Okay. Probably a lot of you, especially if you're in public schools, have been taught that. Okay. There's been a lot of discussion over the years about what's called the missing link. Okay. We'll talk about that several times. The missing link. This is referring to the missing link between humans and animals. Everybody's seen where you see the ape bent over, and then as the pictures progress, you see the ape coming up right. Next thing you know, you got a human standing upright. Everybody's seen that? The ape morphing into a human? That's the missing link, okay? And we're going to talk about that. And this leads to Darwin's famous tree of life, what he coined as the tree of life. And the tree illustrates these evolutionary changes that happen to supposedly these many species throughout all of time. So Darwin drew a tree, and at the base of it was a single-cell organism at the very bottom, and then it sprouts up into this tree. And moving up to the tree, it branches out into different animals, different types and species that are consistent with evolutionary beliefs. Okay, probably all of you have seen that tree that we're talking about. Yes? Some have not? Okay, well, it's very famous. If you take science in a public school, you will see that, for sure. So the resulting picture has many of the fully evolved animals towards the top, including humans, reptiles, birds, dinosaurs, etc. Okay? There's a huge flaw that even a child can see from the tree of life. Okay? None of the animals in the tree, Darwin's tree of life, are what they call transitional. Okay? Very key. There are no modern animals or fossils that have dominant traits from two unrelated groups of species before and after them. Very key to understand that. There's no transitional forms. And even modern versions of the tree shows there's no transitional forms. It still lacks the evidence. So Dr. Stephen Gould, he was a famous, outspoken evolutionary biologist. Keep that in mind. He was an evolutionary biologist, not Christian. He admitted in Natural History, now keep this in mind, that, quote, the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology. So this is the big secret, as Dr. Gould puts it. Remember what I said at the beginning? Keep in mind assumptions and deceptions, okay? So the evolutionary tree that we see in our textbooks have this data, these animal fully formed at the tips and nose, but the transitional part, the morphing part that we just described, is all inference. That's all it is. In any local area, a species does not arise gradually, okay, by the steady transformation of its ancestors that you are taught in school, a lot of you. It appears all at once and fully formed too, and we'll see that in just a minute. In other words, Dr. Gould exposed Darwin's tree, the tree's secret, as he put it, as being extremely flawed and lacking evidence. So a man named Luther Sutherland wrote a letter to Colin Patterson, who is at the British Museum of Natural History. And after reading his book, Patterson, by the way, is a senior paleontologist, just so you know. Luther asked the senior paleontologist Patterson, why didn't you show any of the missing links that we're talking about, these transitional forms? Why didn't you show those in your book? Patterson replied, was this is a senior paleontologist. Quote, I fully agree with your comments on the lack of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would have included them. He goes on to say, I'll lay it on the line. There's not one such fossil. Okay, so these tree of life, this transitional form, these paleontologists are admitting there's not any. It's not there. Although you see it in the book and you're taught it, a lot of you. Again, deception. And these are what the evolutionists are saying. Okay? These aren't Christian sources, by the way. On a secondary note, what Gould is referring to when it says it appears all at once, he's referring to an explosion, okay, of diversified species in the fossil record that show up at roughly the same time. Okay? One of the more famous group of fossils is referred to as what? Anybody know? Something explosion?
Cambrian.
The Cambrian explosion. Who said that over there? What do you like, Snickers or Milky Way?
Bro, Snickers.
Both? All right.
You hooked me up.
Gotta owe you that. All right, so the Cambrian explosion, in short, is the appearance of most major animals in the fossil record, and a wide diversification at roughly the same time. So instead of these transitional forms, where there's no evidence for it, we see a much better answer. Let's look at Genesis 1:24. Then God said, let the earth bring forth living creature according to its kind, cattle and creeping thing and beast of the earth, each according to its kind. And it was so. Well, the Bible kind of shows the Cambrian explosion. It's amazing when you look at the Bible how you see things in science and nature actually unfolding and happening. Okay? You should look at the Bible way before your textbooks. Seems like this might match the Cambrian explosion and another group of fossils appearing all at once, much better than the deception we just heard. Okay? A lot of deception. God said, let there be. And there was. Boom. And there was. All right, so let's look at a little bit of the history. We've seen a lot of evidence refuting evolution already. Last week we went into a lot of statistics that are still over here. Incredibly huge statistics that says it's impossible. So why is it being taught as fact in schools? If we see this overwhelming statistics and things that say it can't be, and we even have senior evolutionary paleontologist admitting deception. So then why? Why is this happening? Okay? A lot of you, some of you may know this, but I have a feeling the majority probably do not know this, the history behind a lot of evolution. I'm not going to go into a lot of it, because there is a lot of it, but here's just a little bit of the history. And of course, there's a whole lot more than just this. The adversary's been working at this long, hard, before I give you a couple of dates, okay? So I realize there's a whole lot more going on, but where did evolution start? Anybody have an idea? Where did it start? Pretty simple answer. Huh? Close. I think I heard somebody say it.
With Darwin?
No, way before that. It started in the Garden of Eden, okay? See, God has a perfect plan, and the adversary comes along and perverts it, okay? He has a perverted version of God's perfect plan. Well, let's fast forward kind of to more recent times. We'll look at 4 books that kind of assisted in this evolutionary belief and push. The first book is Thomas Malthus' book, Essay on the Principle of Population. It was written about 1700s. It had a profound impact on Darwin, because Darwin, it made him believe that the weaker should die off and the stronger should survive. Anybody ever heard of a phrase that might go along with that? Huh?
Natural selection.
No. Survival of the fittest. Very good. Survival of the fittest, okay? So Herbert Spencer coined the phrase survival of the fittest, and it impacted Darwin, okay? It gave the mentality people are expendable. It gave that mentality that people are expendable. What worldview does that sound like to you? Anybody know? Communism. Think of Pol Pot and Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler. They all believed in survival of the fittest, all of them, okay? Think about what they did. Human life is expendable to them. So this ties into many things. The evolutionary philosophy impacts things like abortion that you may not realize. Think about that. It impacts. So the Bible tells us the adversary comes to kill, steal, and destroy. That's what he's here for. That's what he does. Okay, that's not just what he's here for, but that's what he does. Okay. The second book, 1750, Hutton's book, Theory on Earth. It made people doubt that the Earth was 6,000 years old. Then the third book, in the 1800s, Lyell's book, Principles of Geology, made people doubt in the flood. And then the most famous book, probably that most of you know, is Darwin's book. What was that book?
Species.
Okay. You got one now. You ready?
Who?
You.
Oh.
You answered it earlier. But I'll give you credit for that one.
Nice.
So the next 50 years or so of godless thinking, it leads to humanism and racism and communism and Nazism, plans for a new world order. Okay, that's kind of what this does and leads to. So 1925, we have something called the Scopes monkey trial. Has anybody ever heard of that or know what that is? Okay, a few here or there. All right. So this was kind of a trial where they used John Scopes to say, hey, claim that you taught evolution. Well, there's a whole movie made on that. You can watch the movie and learn more about that, okay? In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik. Anybody know what Sputnik is?
Rocket.
Yeah, right. And so some Americans panicked and said, you know what, we're losing the space race. We're losing. The Russians are beating us. And they're teaching evolution over there. So that must be our problem. So they started to push for the teaching of evolution. They started to push that agenda because of the whole space race deal. Something interesting to know in 1959, who was president? Wow, there's a bunch of them. Who was the first one to say it? Huh? Caleb. Somebody over here. Very good. All right. So Dwight D. Eisenhower was president, and he asked for $1 billion from the Department of Health, Education and Welfare's new American Education Fund to promote and publicize new science and evolution. And what he got was $10,500,000 given to the National Science Fund Foundation for what's called the BSCS series. And in '63, this led to the average mention of evolution in science books that went from just under 4,000 words to just under 40,000 words. That funding did that. It made it go crazy with the amount of words taught in our science books about evolution, okay? A little side note about this. This is about the same time Madeline Murray O'Hara pushed for prayer to be removed from school. So do you see some of the influences in the decline, all right? So a couple of charts that I want you to see, and these charts are interesting because they show that per year, the more aggressive the teaching of evolution is compared to these that I'm about to mention, they track almost to a T, okay? So, first one, this is where you can see the words for evolution go up. So you see where the line shows 1963, it shows how the words jump from a minimal amount to a huge amount, just under 40,000 words in 63, all right? Now watch how these statistics track, okay? Watch 1963 and how that jumps. STDs went up 385%. You see that? Divorce rates went up 111%. Violent crime goes up 995%. Unwed birth rates go up 553%. Again, 1963, this is tracking with the evolution push, teaching. Okay? That's why that line is there for 63. The scholastic aptitude test declined. How smart kids were. In fact, they even had to dumb down the test to make it to where everybody could pass it, to have good scores still. Okay? Unwed married couples up 725%. This is tracking perfectly with the evolutionary push in 1963. You can overlap these things and they almost all match. Okay? Teen suicide rate jumps. Look at that. It jumps huge because of the teaching of evolution. So do you get the idea with these charts? Okay, just a few more. Illegal drug use by youth up 6,000%. Child abuse up 2,300%. It's huge. So when schools teach you that you're nothing more than an animal, guess what? We get in return what we're being taught. It's called reaping what we sow. Very, very important. These things skyrocket in parallel with the evolution push. God gives us creation, and the devil, wanting to be God, he perverts it. And you'll see this over and over. So when you remove God and a moral standard, and we see this, you remove God, you insert evolution, and it's no longer an objective standard in choosing right and wrong. No longer. Okay? It goes from, thus saith the Lord, to what saith the majority. That's what it goes to. Okay? It's all about the majority opinion, not what God says. Most don't realize these things stem from evolution, but you can see that, how they track precisely. The ACLU, does anybody know who the ACLU is?
Oh, man.
Yes.
Who is it?
No.
Huh?
No idea.
I don't know what it stands for, but there it is.
The American Civil Liberties Union. Very good. Thank you. But in short, but in short, it's the atheist group, okay? So if you ever heard of the ACLU, basically you're talking about the atheist group, okay? Let me give you one slide on them to show you what they're all about. Now this, again, is not me saying this. This is what they say. Check that out from the ACLU. They say their goal is communism, okay? They make it real clear what their goal is. That's their comment right there. They want to teach you that you're nothing more than an animal. That's what they want you to believe, and that's exactly how we see society acting today in a lot of ways. All right. So moving on, the Stanley Miller experiment. Is anybody familiar with this? Anybody ever heard of the Stanley Miller experiment? One.
Yes.
Very good. Say again.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
What is it?
Selected evidence.
Right. So in 1871. Darwin suggested in a famous letter that the original spark, as he called it, of life may have begun in a warm little pond. Okay. By the way, does that sound like fact or fiction?
Fiction.
A little bit of fiction, yeah. Maybe opinion, but definitely fiction. So this led to experiments conducted by Stanley Miller at the University of Chicago in 1952. Yet here's something else that had this heavy influence, this push for evolution. Okay. So he designed a chamber to simulate the warm little pond. Of hydrogen-rich mixture of methane, ammonia, and water vapor. He selected these elements believing big assumption there. Remember what I said at the beginning, assumptions and deceptions. Big assumption that these were present in Earth's early atmosphere, which had never been observed, hence the big assumption. That's why that's there. And this is non-science, it's not the scientific method. These elements, by the way, are also the building blocks of amino acids. So he specifically chose elements that he knew were building blocks of aminos and not the early Earth's atmosphere. So when the chamber was electrified to simulate the spark, as he called it, the result was, guess what? Amino acids. Imagine that, when you put them in deliberately, that's what you're going to get. So the soup, is what they called it, of elements became famously known as the primordial soup. Has anybody ever heard of that?
Yes.
Okay, very good. So based on these loose opinions, deficient experiments, spontaneous generation that we just talked about was deceptively resurrected. Again, deception. Do you see the reoccurring theme with evolution? A lot of assumptions, a lot of deception. This raises a lot of questions, or at least it should. What did the experiment really prove? What did it really show? Okay. Do we have any evidence that the primordial soup ever existed? No. Would the conditions in the chamber even be suitable for life? Well, I can answer that's a no for you. Okay. The truth is that the only thing Miller's experiment really proved was that when you put the building blocks of amino acids deliberately in a chamber and then you carefully electrify it, certain amino acids may form. Well, imagine that when you put them in the chamber to begin with. Okay? So this does not prove that the soup existed millions of years ago. In fact, there is zero evidence for that. None. Even evolutionists today, they don't even think that these elements were those of Earth's early atmosphere at all that Miller used. So these aminos are a long, long way from having life. Okay? Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. Most of you probably know this from science classes. And you got to have the right number and the right kind of aminos to link up in the right structure to create just a single protein molecule, let alone a cell or an organism. Okay? We'll go into this more in depth when we look at the cell's complexity, because it's pretty amazing when we look at that in future weeks. But it's a long way from a living cell, a long, long way from having a living cell. And you got to have the proteins in the right sequence and structures, plus enzymes, so the list goes on and on. Then it requires DNA and genetic information. So you see, it's a long way from having life. Last and certainly not least, the life needs this spark, as he put it, and this has never been repeated since creation. In fact, lightning, which is what Miller was supposed to be simulating, is known to kill life, not create it. Have you ever seen somebody hit by lightning? Did it help him out pretty good? Make him a little bit bigger and stronger? No, I don't think so. No, doesn't help the guy out at all. So Miller's experiment could never prove abiogenesis, and nothing ever has. Now follow this carefully, because you'll see the impossibilities even past what we just discussed. 2 key points. Okay? Miller also excluded oxygen in reducing atmosphere because, key point number 1, life could not evolve with oxygen present. Life cannot evolve with oxygen present. Any aminos that try to combine are oxidized. You cut open a banana and lay it out, what's going to happen to it? It's going to turn brown. Same thing with an apple or any living thing. It oxidizes, okay? Key point number 2. One of his gases was ammonia. And this presented a problem because it is destroyed by UV light, okay? UV light must be blocked by the ozone, which is made from oxygen. So it kind of seems like there's a problem with this. Let me explain a little bit more simply. Ammonia, one of the gases needed for the experiment, is destroyed by UV, which is made from oxygen. So life cannot evolve without oxygen. Life cannot evolve with oxygen. Okay? So what's the solution? What's the solution to it?
It didn't evolve.
It didn't evolve. Very good. You gotta know when you share it if you want to. Yeah, very good. It didn't evolve. And ironically, what happened in the chamber was his mixture was actually poisonous to life, not beneficial to life at all. When proteins or even embryos are placed in a chamber like that, they are burned beyond recognition. What he actually made was 85% tar, 13% carboxylic acid, and 2% aminos. 98% poisonous. I mentioned this a little bit ago, but just a little bit deeper for just briefly. It takes 20 aminos that are needed for life, kind of like letters in an alphabet, okay? And they go together to make proteins, kind of like the letters go together to make sentences. The two aminos he produced would bond with the tar and the acid more than they would with each other. So you got to have a bunch of aminos to make a protein, and a bunch of those to make a cell, and a bunch of cells to make an organism. And the two aminos he got in a toxic combination by using elements he knew would produce aminos, it would be like dropping a box of toothpicks that land and two cross that look like a T, and then claiming that's the Webster's Dictionary. That's about the difference we're talking about here. Huge difference. So this experiment had even more problems than just that. If that wasn't enough to convince you, here's a little bit more. The aminos he produced were what they call backwards. The smallest proteins have 70 to 100 amino acids that have to bond, and they have to bond in the precise order. In addition, they unbond in water faster than they bond. What did he say they were bonding in? Soup, water. So they would unbond much faster. Okay? Pretty big problem there. One single cell is more complex than the spatial. So the bottom line is, Miller's experiment is completely false. If you hadn't heard anything else I've said, Miller's experiment is completely false. Okay? And you can review the notes to figure out why. But this advanced evolution in a pretty tremendous way, along with some of the other books that we talked about and some of Darwin's influences in his life. So last week I gave you some statistics. Well, that's just a reason, here's some of them, a reason why just a few of them are true, okay? The enzyme by random, the building block of the gene, this statistic right here, calculated by Vikram Singh, is the probability of that happening by random is 1 in 10 to the power of 40,000. Literally impossible. Remember, the grains of sand on all the seashores is just 10 to the 23rd. All of the seashores, every grain of sand, okay? Huge numbers. And then the possibilities of life. We talked about this huge odd. I don't think that, yeah, it is right here. So, actually, that's not it either. I don't even have it up here. So if we were to lay out a cell already fully formed and functioning and break every chemical bond in it, lay it out, the odds that it would reassemble in best conditions, not Miller's experiment and not in primordial soup, but already working properly and in a lab, the fact that it would reassemble is 1 in 10 to the 100,000 millionth billionth power. Yes, sir.
Actually, they found not too long ago in 1976, I forgot who it was, they found a chemical enzyme, a ribonucleic protein called telomerase. And when at the end of the DNA chain, when it starts breaking it down to make proteins and things like that, it cuts off 200 to 4,000 chains. So that's how you're dying. So technically it's impossible to rebuild yourself.
Yeah, exactly. That's why these, thank you, that's a great thing to point out. That's one reason why, yeah. So you see why these odds are so huge, okay? Why we say it's literally impossible. The more we see science, the more we see it's impossible, the more we look at it. The more science is uncovered, the more we see the Bible has it right and has had it right all along. So the history of evolution, it isn't really exciting stuff to talk about, so thank you for listening today and paying attention. But I think it's important to know because there are a lot of false assumptions and a lot of deception. So it's important to know these things, okay? Next week, we will look at how experts date. I'm not talking about boy-girl dating. We're talking about dating techniques for millions of years, fossils, etc. Dating techniques. We'll look at young Earth evidences, including the Grand Canyon. Have you ever heard about the Grand Canyon and how that shows evolution? Well, we'll look at that as well.